What's going on, everyone? We are finally getting to the very end of set 4 spoilers. We're starting to see some people actually open up the physical cards and spoil the physical cards rather than just the digital images, which of course is going to lead to kind of the final cards that we have yet to see within set 4. Of course, the official release is coming up quick, and pre-releases are probably starting soon, depending on where you're at. And so I'll have videos about that soon. But we're going to talk about all the remaining cards, and there's quite a few of them. Now, some of them are going to be the draft chaff, the commons, the ones that you don't really find in your normal play in terms of Premiere. But we're still going to go over them, albeit relatively briefly, because there's not too much to talk about with those ones. But there are a few that are pretty exciting. So I want to say a big thank you to my patrons, and thank you to anyone who's been watching the channel for supporting the channel. Also, I have a TCG player link in the description down below if you want to pick up any of the new set 4 cards. Let's dive into our first one, and we got a lot to talk about. So let's get it. First off, the Starhawk. This one's actually a pretty cool one. This one's a 9-cost space unit in command heroism. It is a 6/9 ambusher. So 6/9 ambusher. We've got New Republic vehicle and a capital ship tag, which, isn't too bad, depending on if we get any more capital ship synergies. But the interesting part about this is the fact that it has an ability, when you're paying any cost, you may pay half as many resources rounded up. So essentially, the cherry on top, final ramp piece to really make you just dominate in terms of playing a million cards in the late game. A 9-resource space unit that is a 6/9 ambusher is pretty bad. I would not play that in basically any deck. The fact that you get to ramp a little bit does make it a lot more interesting. If I think about the cards or the decks that are going to be playing potentially high cost units, as well as being able to actually utilize this ability later on in the game, I think of like Luke Green, for example, or like Obi-Wan Green, or like Yoda Green. Yoda Green was probably like the most exciting one for me, where you're ramping a little bit in the early game. You've got a couple of the really nice units like Luke Skywalker. You do have that soft control strategy a little bit, but then you play like the Starhawk later on, and then suddenly you're deploying like Ewing reinforcements and Home One, or like Zillow Beasts, and doing multiple massive plays in the late game, and that actually can finish out a game. So is this good enough? I don't really think so. I don't think this fixes the issues with those decks. It's pretty sweet later on in the game, and it is one of the few legendaries we have not seen yet. So that's fun to talk about. But in terms of actual viability, I don't really see this doing a whole lot. I suppose there's another strategy with this where you might be able to like cheat it out in terms of like sneak attack or like that type of effect. But that's not really going to do a whole lot, where you're trying to reduce the costs of some way. I just don't really see that working out in terms of getting it down early. There's nothing that gets it down early enough. Like there's no triple arc raid in heroism, for example, really to do some work. I mean, there is the new aggression event that allows you to cheat on 2 of its costs, and so you can get this down essentially for 7 resources, but that's still a little bit too late for what we're trying to do with it, because then we also have to get to the following turn and then start playing a bunch of stuff. So maybe there's something there. I just don't really see it at the current moment. If this was in villainy, maybe we're talking, because there is Piet out there, right? Capital ship, villainy. There's more capital ships and things to be playing. Next up, we've got Jump to Lightspeed. This one's pretty sweet. It's a 2-cost event in Cunning. Return a friendly space unit and any number of non-leader upgrades on it to its owner's hand. The next time you play a copy of that unit this phase, you may play it for free. So the idea here is you put this on any of your space units, and you essentially just get to replay it that turn for free, or for the 2 costs. Now, what's also nice about this is that you do get to return those upgrades. So if there are upgrades on it, then they don't necessarily go to the discard pile. And also what's nice about this is if you had some sort of upgrade that maybe you wanted to move to another unit, or maybe that unit's got a lot of damage on it and you wanted to replay it, but in order to bounce it, then you would lose those upgrades, you can kind of avoid all that. This one I don't really see being insanely powerful. It is interesting with the upgrades, but let's say you have like your opponent playing perilous position or traitorous. I suppose you can go ahead and negate those a little bit by you pay 2 cost and your opponent has to pay additional costs to keep up with that kind of effect, right? You get to play your unit for free. And again, it's any copy of that unit, so it can even be an expensive unit, but they have to pay the full of resources of whatever upgrade they played on it. So that's kind of interesting. But I say the most interesting thing to me is to play things like Home 1 again for free, right? That type of effect where maybe it's got some sort of when played ability. That's where it gets kind of interesting. Now, I also thought of like, okay, can I play some sort of villainy deck where you've got some really powerful ETB effects like Ruthless Raider, for example. Well, suddenly you pay 2 and you get a 2 damage to their base, 2 damage to a unit, right? That's not too bad. If you've got a Fet's Fire Spray, you can kind of do the new adventure thing where you go ahead and play it for 2 and you get to have it immediately readied up again. That type of effect can be maybe something there because the new adventure we did see with Double Yellow Boba. So maybe there's something there with Jump to Lightspeed. But it is only space units. It is only friendly space units. So I suppose we could see something there. But again, very niche and very specific. Next up, we've got In the Heat of Battle. This one's a 2-cost event in Vigilance. This one's interesting because it gives each unit Sentinel and everyone loses Saboteur. Of course, you can give Saboteur after the fact, after this event has taken place, with like a breaking in, for example. But this Saboteur will only go ahead, or the units losing Saboteur for this phase will only happen when they're on the battlefield, when this event is played. So essentially what this does is just makes it so that all your units have to go ahead and smash. Which I know how that sounds, but that's what's going to happen, right? I don't think this is necessarily all that great. Realistically, what's going to happen is when you're playing decks that care about this type of effect, you probably already have Sentinels, so it doesn't really do a whole lot. And on top of that, you kind of need to have a decent amount of units or play a bunch of units as you go along the curve in order for you to actually have a bunch of units to gain Sentinel. These types of effects where it makes it so that each unit gains something or each unit gets bumped up, we've not seen any of them really do a whole lot of work. And that's partially because going wide hasn't really been a strategy. And so those mass effects don't really affect that many units on the board. It's usually like 1 to 2 to 3 different units that are actually affected. In this case, I think it's going to be very, very similar. Next up, we've got another legendary here in Hondo Ohnaka, a 4-cost ground unit in double vigilance. It's a 3/5 shielded, and in Garsac it's a 4/5 shielded, which, you know, is something. On attack, you may take control of a non-pilot upgrade on unit and attach it to a different eligible unit. This one's kind of interesting. I could see this more of a sideboard option initially, but the reason I say that is the thing that you're going to want to be taking control of is like traitorous or perilous position, and then moving it on to your opponent's units and stealing them or giving them -2/-2. The overall body, the 3/5 shielded, is not really going to mean much to a double vigilance deck. And there are not many double vigilance decks. Like you have Yoda or you have like Iden, and those decks don't really care for a Hondo, to be honest, in most situations, because you don't really have a bunch of units that your opponents will be playing upgrades on. And if Hondo is going to be in your deck and you're taking control of like shield tokens or experience tokens, oftentimes it's just going to be Hondo that you put it on. So I'll say this on attack trigger is kind of interesting, mainly as maybe a sideboard option is what I'm thinking. But realistically, what will be most likely is, because it's a double vigilance card, you're not really going to see it be played in many spots. Double vigilance heroism is the most likely, like Yoda, as I mentioned, because they're oftentimes relying on a few more units in the early game to keep track or keep pace with your opponents. But this to me seems like a very interesting one, maybe a sideboard option, but because of the double vigilance, I'm not really seeing it. It was like double aggression, you know, or double cunning or something like that. I could see something there because that's a lot more interesting. But unfortunately, in double vigilance, I just don't see the deck where you're going to want to be playing Mr. Hondo here. Next up, we got Lightspeed Assault, and this one is very interesting. It's a 2-cost event. In command, you defeat a friendly space unit and deal damage equal to its power to an enemy space unit. So essentially, defeat one of your own space units and hopefully kill your opponent's space unit. So 2 cost, you lose a space unit, you kill their space unit. Okay, but after the fact, if you do that, you deal indirect damage equal to the enemy unit's power to its controller. So the idea here is, hopefully, you've got some sort of cheap space unit and you smack it into one of their bigger space units. And suddenly, you don't really care about that unit. Hence why it's the Lightspeed Assault, the one where we saw Hondo kind of sacrifice her capital ship. Because you don't really care about that ship. It's not something that you're actually using to take out your opponent's specific unit. Maybe this is something to actually go ahead and cheat in a win. The reason I think about that is, okay, if you're just sacrificing a unit and killing one of their units and you deal a little bit of indirect damage, like 3 to 4 on a regular space unit to their base, that's not really going to be a winning move in most situations, defeating your own unit to do that. But if you are like late in the game, let's say, and your opponent's like playing Piet, for example. I'm just thinking about this because Piet's a pretty popular one. They play like a Devastator and they get like a 9/6 and you've got, some random A-Wing or something, right? And you sacrifice your A-Wing into their Devastator, and suddenly they have to allocate 9 indirect damage amongst units and bases they control. So assuming they're going to die to the 9 damage, they'll, deal 5 to their Devastator, which kills their Devastator. They take the other 4, and suddenly that's not a bad situation to be in. So something like that, where I think it's a very niche, particular scenario, I think could be good. Otherwise, I'm not really seeing the value of this. Maybe you've got like a Thrawn green deck and you can defeat your own units to get a little bit of value there. But then even in that case, the indirect damage to its controller doesn't really mean a whole lot because Thrawn isn't that aggressive. So I don't know. This one's very, very interesting. Very weird. But of course, I think could be fun to use. Next up, we got Bunker Defender. This one's, of course, just kind of like a mediocre common. We got a 1-cost ground unit in command. It's a 2/1 Imperial Trooper. If you control a vehicle unit, you get Sentinel on this guy. I don't think this guy's going to be played at all. I don't even necessarily think it's very good in draft. A 2/1 for 1 is just too weak in most situations. It does have the Imperial tag, but this is a common. It is what it is. It's just not a very good card. Next up, we've got Focus Fire. This is a 4-cost event in command. You choose a unit. Each friendly vehicle unit in the same arena deals damage equal to its power to that unit. Kind of like that maximum firepower from set 1, where each Imperial unit or the 2 Imperial units deal damage equal to its power to a single unit. That's what this kind of reminds me of. You've got a bunch of random space units, and suddenly you can take out a big space unit. I don't know if this is really going to be that great. We haven't even seen like synchronized strikes or Akbars or things that also do something else work all that often. Heck, even Strike True is not something that we've seen too often. And this is 1 additional cost, and it's a little bit more restrictive, right? Only same arena and only friendly vehicle units. So I don't really see this being all that great. Potentially a more draft playable card. Next up, we've got Apology Accept. This is a 1-cost event in command villainy. It's defeat a friendly unit. You may give 2 experience tokens to a unit. Now, this one I think we could do something with, right? It's essentially a 1-cost event. You defeat something that's trash, like a battle droid token, and suddenly you're generating 2 experience tokens. The thing I'm thinking about is like a Wat Tambor type effect, where you actually are encouraged to go ahead and defeat a bunch of units, and you're able to go ahead and leverage those defeated units to additional power, or 2 additional effect on the board, or some sort of additional damage. You turn 1, play your unit, you attack in with it. On turn 2, you apology accept and play another unit, and suddenly you get to pump up another unit. Or maybe it's like turn 3 or turn 4 where you attack with that unit first, you play this, you get to experience on something, you could use Wat Tambor's ability, you get to attack in, and suddenly, you got way more damage out of that unit than you had initially planned on. Of course, there's always the Thrawn potential where, okay, can I play like this when defeated deck with getting some value out of my events and going ahead and getting value out of my unit? Potentially, that might be a situation where Apology Accepted is useful. Definitely again, specific synergy, niche piece, but maybe some use there. Next up, we got all wings report in. One cost event in command. Exhaust up to 2 friendly space units. For each unit exhausted this way, create an X-Wing token. Now, I've been playing a good amount of Akbar, as you all saw from my previous video. This one is essentially like a souped up Akbar ability for your command decks, right? Because Akbar, you pay 1, you get to exhaust a unit, and then you get to create an X-Wing token, or that controller gets to create an X-Wing token. This is friendly space units, so it only works on your own units, and it does require you to have space units. So this one, I honestly haven't been super impressed with Akbar's ability in general, and that's what it kind of reminds me of. Now, dedicating a whole card slot for it, I think, is even worse. So I'm not really a fan of this. I will say one of the decks that I do think it may have potential is like Vader. So Vader, you're going to be generating a bunch of TIE fighters, and suddenly you can exhaust those 2 TIE fighters to sacrifice on 2 damage, which is nothing in the grand scheme of things, and you get 2 2/2s. That's pretty decent, right? That's pretty decent. And I think that could be good in like a Vader deck. So maybe there, but outside of that, not really seeing a place for that. Next up, we got Face Off, 3-cost event in aggression. If no player has taken the initiative this phase, you may ready an enemy unit. If you do, ready a friendly unit in the same arena. Sort of like is it Admiral Ozzel, the 2-cost aggression villainy card that allows you to play out a unit that immediately readies and things like that. I think that's pretty interesting. But here's the problem with this one is the first clause. If no player has taken the initiative this phase, you basically have to be in a situation where your opponent has not attacked and you've already attacked, right? Because you could ready an enemy unit that's already readied, and then you get to ready a friendly unit that's been exhausted. And so if your, let's say, opponent takes initiative, you can't leverage that where you can go ahead and just ready up a unit and they can't have any interaction with it. Now, of course, you could still get value out of that, right? Where your opponent has not taken initiative and they haven't attacked. And as I said, you can go ahead and ready up that already ready unit. But the problem with this is most of the time when you're doing all the plays during the turn, you're going to be in a situation where your opponent has taken initiative and then you're going to want to be playing face off. So I think the timing on this is going to be very awkward for you to get a lot of value out of it. So not a huge fan of face off. Next up, we've got Insurgent Saboteurs. Nice little common here. 6-cost ground unit in aggression. It's a 6/5 Saboteur Rebel. On attack, you may defeat an upgrade. Not going to be playable in terms of Premiere, but definitely one of the better kind of solid late game cards in draft. This is one of those cards where I'd be on the lookout for and be like, oh, I'd love to have 1 to 2 copies of this in my draft deck. Defeating an upgrade, I think, is going to be extremely relevant in the draft format. So 6/5 Saboteur, 6 costs, totally reasonable there. Next up, we got Fly Casual, 1-cost event in Cunning Heroism. Ready a vehicle unit. It can't attack bases for this phase. So definitely an interesting one in terms of playing a deck that's going the pilot route, maybe attacking bases, and then maybe you use this 1-cost event to get a little bit of tempo advantage. I could definitely see that, especially as a sideboard option where you're playing things like Millennium Falcons and Chewbacca pilots, and you're getting big space units that actually can take a couple hits. I think Fly Casual could do some work there. If it could attack a base, obviously this card would be significantly more expensive. We've seen like Face Off where you get to ready up a unit, or Bravado, which gets to ready up a unit. Like those are very restrictive and have so many requirements to meet to where I don't think that we'll see that. This one, attacking units, I think it could have some potential as a sideboard card, but even then it's going to be pretty rare. Next up, we've got Kimogila, Heavy Fighter, 4-cost space unit in it. Cunning. We got 3/4 Underworld Vehicle Fighter. When play, you deal 3 indirect damage to a player. Exhaust each unit damage this way. This one actually does have some potential. I could definitely see a situation where you have the initiative, you play this, you're in an aggressive cunning deck, which not like aggression cunning, but like an aggro cunning deck, and your opponent just can't afford to take the damage, and so all their units get exhausted, or maybe can't afford to exhaust their units because they need those to trade with your units and then take 3 damage to their base. That's actually not bad, right? We play like 4 Cause in Rebel decks just for 4 damage guaranteed to your opponent's base. If you think about it like that, maybe Kimogila Heavy Fighter has some options. And of course, if you play it in some sort of deck that cares about indirect damage, it gets a little bit even more valuable. Also, in a, let's say, triple or a grade deck, hitting this isn't too bad because you're going to guarantee that 3 indirect damage. I will say it's definitely something where you're going to want to be playing an aggressive deck because your opponent wants to be in a bad situation for taking either modes. Okay, exhausting my units, bad. Taking the 3 indirect damage, also bad. And that's where you put him in a bad spot. But seems okay. Nothing exciting, but okay. Next up, we've got MC-30 Assault Frigate. It's a 5-cost space unit in command. It's a 5/5 Rebel Vehicle capital ship. It's got Overwhelm. It's got Raid 1. It's pretty mediocre. Not necessarily an exciting card, with one exception. Okay, so obviously a 5-cost space unit in command, a 5/5 with Overwhelm and Raid 1 is nothing to write home about. But it is a capital ship, and it doesn't have the heroism tag. So now we can play this at 4 cost in Piet. Or if you do have Piet out, it's a 3-cost 5/5 Overwhelm Raid 1 ship. That is something that could be decent, right? I mentioned this with capital ships in general, but as we start to see low-cost capital ships, 3, 4, or even 5, that's where it starts to become really impressive with Piet. Turn 1, you play something, turn 2, you're ramping or whatever, but this gives you another option. Maybe you don't hit that ramp, or maybe you're playing a more controlling vigilance Piet deck and you just want to play a big space unit. I could definitely see this being a viable option in, I'd say, more of a sideboard capacity, because you still want to be playing resupply carriers and things like that. The 5-drop slot is a little bit awkward for Piet, because oftentimes like turn 1 or turn 2, you're trying to ramp or deal with their units. And so if let's say you are playing resupply or super laser technician on turn 2, well, by turn 3, you have 5 resources. So you can go ahead and, play a ruthless raider or a resupply carrier. And I'd rather be doing that over like an assault frigate. So interesting. Not sure if it's really what you want, but it's certainly something you can consider in a Piet deck. Next up, we got Clone Combat Squadron. It's a 4-cost space unit in command. It's a 3/3 Republic Vehicle Fighter, and it gets +1/+1 for each other's friendly space unit. This one immediately is going to be something that I'm really unimpressed with in the vast majority of decks. If I just think about like pilot decks like Wedge, Luke, or anything like that, at most you'll have 2 other space units. It's a 4-cost 5/5 space unit. It doesn't do anything else. Not really good enough, even in those specific scenarios. But then we consider Vader, the new Vader. And you play a deck where maybe you have 4 or 5 space units, and it's like a 7/7 or an 8/8 for 4. That's something that could be worth considering, right? Especially if you're playing like Victor Leader. Now you're getting +2/+2 on Cloaked Combat Squadron, and you're playing all these little TIE fighters or things that can go wide. I could definitely see something there, especially if, let's say, you deploy Vader onto this. You get +5/+5. It creates 2 TIE fighter tokens, right? Which is already a 10/10. You probably have a couple other fighters already. It's like a 12/12, 13/13 leader units. That's pretty interesting to me. I could definitely see it maybe as an option for Vader. Outside of that, don't really see a use for it. It just doesn't do anything when it comes down. It's just going to be a big fat unit. And I don't think that's good enough, especially on a 4-cost. Like if this was like, let's say a 3-cost 2/2, maybe you have something there, because you could be like a 3/3 or 4/4 earlier on in the game. But because it's a little bit later, I think the viability falls off. But certainly could be something for Vader. Next up, we got, is it Jarek Yeager or Jarek Yeager? Don't really know, to be honest. It's one of the Resistance cards. I believe it's from the Resistance show. And I do not care for it, so I have not seen it. Besides like the baseline main character in is it Kazuda? 2-cost ground unit. Command 2/3 with piloting of 2. While you control a ground unit and a space unit, attached unit gains Sentinel. It's +2/+2 for that pilot upgrade. So +2/+2 for 2 resources is pretty bad. That's definitely below the curve. +2/+3 is what you're expecting. So you need to get value out of the effect. The 2/3 body as a unit for 2 is also terrible. Are you going to get use out of this? No. I've played a bunch of Lando. It's kind of hard to have a ground unit and a space unit and have pilots in your deck. I just think this card's pretty bad. I think that there's potential for it in draft, and that's where I'll keep it. Next up, we got Cloaked Starviper, 4-cost space unit in Vigilance. It's a 3/2 Underworld Vehicle Fighter. When played, you give 2 shield tokens to it. Now that I'm saying it, I think we've already talked about this card. But it is, a 4-cost 4/3, 4/2 in Garsaxa, which is something. Outside of that, I don't really see this being useful. Shield tokens just die too fast. It dies to perilous position, etc., etc., etc. But I believe we talked about this card, so I'm going to go ahead and move past it with my initial impressions being pretty mediocre. Next up, we've got 2-cost space unit in Vigilance, Royal Security Fighter. It's a 2/2 with Grit. It's got Naboo vehicle fighter on it. The first thing I thought of was like Asajj, right? You play this, you deal 1 damage to this, it becomes a 3-1, and your opponent's space unit takes a little bit of damage. I think that's actually something that maybe is worthwhile. But a 2-2 with grit for 2 is usually just going to die to everything. Like everything. Daring Raid kills it 1 shot. Your perilous positions kill it in 1 shot. Even just a simple ping, multiple pings, like a Cad Bane. Let's say your opponent plays Cad Bane, they play their unit, and now you're forced to trade with this Royal Security Fighter. Otherwise, any other unit that they play is just going to be able to ping it off. So I'm not a huge fan of it, but maybe something in Asajj, right? Next up, we've got Omicron Strikecraft, 3-cost space unit in Vigilance. Is a 2-3 Sentinel, and that's it. I think this is significantly worse than Black Sun Starfighter. So Black Sun Starfighter is the kind of comparison because that is a 3-2 space unit Sentinel. The reason I say it's significantly worse is because even though Black Sun Starfighter does die to Daring Raid, does die to Perilous Position, they have to use that card for it. Whereas Omicron Strikecraft, when it comes down, your opponent could just kill it with an A-Wing and still have their unit around. Kill it with a black one with an upgrade, or kill it with whatever turn 1 space unit that they have, which the vast majority of them now actually will be attacking with that 3 power. That to me is significantly worse. Whereas Black Sun Starfighter at least forces your opponent to do something else so that their A-Wings or whatnot can't just immediately trade with it. So, can't just immediately trade with it. So, not a huge fan of this, and I don't think it's going to be all that great. Next up, we got Outer Rim Outlaws, 3-cost ground unit Vigilance, 3-3 Underworld Bounty Hunter shielded. Don't think this card's very good in the average deck. It's going to take you 2 attacks to go out and kill out the average 3-drop, and unfortunately, well, you would probably just trade. I suppose you can go ahead and kill their turn 1 play oftentimes, and keep this around as a 3-3. I think this has potential in Gar Saxon, as I've mentioned a lot of other times. These like baseline units that get some upgrade when they come in. This is a 3-cost 4-3 shielded in Gar Saxon. That's a lot better. But outside of that, I don't really see this being played all that often. Next up, we've got Munificent frigate. 5-cost space unit in Vigilance. It's a 4-7 separatist vehicle capital ship. It is a capital ship. It can be played as a, 4-cost in Piet Blue or something like that. It is a 4-7. I'm not a huge fan of this. It is a separatist unit also, which means that if you're playing like Count Dooku, you could potentially get this out a little bit earlier by applying exploit to it. But this to me is kind of like a pretty baseline, like maybe it's a draft common that you'll play. But outside of that, it is literally just a 5-resource 4-7. I'd rather have the additional power in my earlier earlier capital ship that we talked about, the 5-5 Overwhelm Raid 1, forget the name, but it's also 5 costs. I'd rather have that over this in Piet, for example. So I suppose. Next up, we got Shadowed Hover Tank. We're at 4-cost ground unit in Cunning. It's a 5-3 fringe vehicle tank. It's got Sentinel. I don't like the 3 toughness. One of the big things about Sentinels is that you really want a higher toughness so that your units can't just trade with it. And this just trades with everything. Heck, even like a Battlefield Marine, it just trades with. That to me really cheapens the viability of a Sentinel such as this. So not that great. Maybe decent in draft. Next up, we've got Corporate Defense Shuttle. It's a 2-cost space unit in Vigilance. It's a 3-5 separatist vehicle transport. This unit can't attack. So the first thing I thought of is Kazuda. Makes it so that it can attack. So Kazuda Blue, suddenly you've got a 3-5 for 2. That's kind of insane. I'm going to be honest, guys. That's kind of insane. A 3-5 space unit for 2 resources is really good. On another note, if you give it Sentinel, it's really obnoxious as well. But you'd have to give it some sort of Sentinel effect by piloting it, probably, because there's not that many upgrades that will really do it. So obviously the pilots that we've talked about that give it Sentinel, maybe you've got something there and it becomes a just massive brick wall in space. Like, let's say just give it +1/+1, which I believe most of the pilots are like +1/+2 or +2/+2 for Sentinel. Let's say just +1/+2 or +1/+1 rather. It's a 4/6, and that's going to trade with every turn 1 and turn 2 space unit in the game, basically. So that will be a brick wall, and that could be something that is tough to deal with. And also in Kazuda, it's a 3-5. That's not bad. Next up, we got Hot Shot Maneuver. It's a 1-cost event in aggression. Choose a friendly unit for each of its on-attack abilities. Deal 2 damage to a different enemy unit. Then attack with the chosen unit. So I was trying to think about this card. Obviously, the first thing is, okay, if it has an on attack trigger, you deal 2 damage to a different enemy unit and you get to attack with it. That's not bad. That's not bad. Maybe you kill something, doesn't require it to be in the same arena. You can hit a space unit. Oftentimes those have 2 toughness. It's interesting. Then I was like, okay, what about on attack triggers? Like, is there a unit with multiple on attack triggers that off the top of my head? And I don't really think so. Like, you have to go ahead and apply a new upgrade on that unit to get multiple on attack triggers. So the vast majority of the time, you will get 2 damage and then get to attack with the unit. Okay, is that good enough? I think in some cases it will be. Like, even if you're against a deck that's like decent, well, if you have a deck that has a lot of on attack triggers, so that's the first requirement, and your opponent is in a situation where the 2 damage will be relevant, I think that could be interesting. So maybe a sideboard option. But I don't know if there's decks that actually have enough on attack triggers, like on attack abilities, right? Like raid 1 doesn't work. It has to be an on attack ability on that unit. It's like a Y-Wing, for example, or a black one. For those 2 go in the same deck, and it's aggression, both of them. So that could work. But outside of that, I'm not really sure. Like, you'd have to give a bunch of on attack triggers to something, which is a lot more difficult. Next up, we got Seasoned Fleet Admiral. This is a 2-cost 1/4 rebel. Very important. And it says when an opponent draws 1 or more cards during the action phase, you may give an experience token to a unit. I think this has some serious potential in certain matchups. It's got the rebel tag, which means Fleet Lieutenant, Wing Leader work with it. It is a 2-cost 2/4 essentially on attacks. And if you can get a single experience token on this guy, it is suddenly a 3/5. And you don't have to give it to this unit. You can give it to any unit. This is much more of like a hate card for those more controlling decks, or the decks that really are going to be drawing a couple cards here and there. I'm thinking like the decks that play Yoda, for example. Boom. Suddenly you get an experience token on this, you pass it to something else, and it's actually a really good card. If your opponent's playing the random card decks like Palpatine, or you're playing like, for some reason, Trench or Yoda, like this suddenly hoses them. Depending on the meta, of course, but I think this definitely has potential. It has the rebel tag, which is important. It's got a decent baseline stat. Like, I wouldn't mind playing this on turn 1. It's very likely to not die, and you get to attack for 2. Like, that's not bad at all. So I definitely think this has potential in the meta as a sideboard option. Next up, we've got Tam Rivor, 3-cost ground unit in Vigilance Villainy. It's a 2/5, pretty poor stat line. Don't care about that, but it does pilot for 2, giving you 2+2/+2, and an on attack trigger of give an enemy unit in this arena -1/-1 for this phase. So we talked about this earlier. +2/+2, not good enough in general. It's below the average. So the on attack trigger or whatever ability they are getting has to be good. This one gives -1/-1. We've seen how powerful like Jedi lightsaber can be. I think this does have a little bit of potential. The problem is that you have to pilot this onto something. It doesn't give enough stat line to where the space unit is likely to survive. Right? Jedi lightsaber is +3/+3, and your ground units are already bigger. I don't really see this being all that fantastic. Maybe in certain scenarios, because you can split this up, right? Like where you attack a certain unit, but then give -1/-1 to another unit. Like maybe that's something that could be good, where you're able to go ahead and kind of wipe their board with this on attack trigger. But the +2/+2 just scares me off a little bit. If this was +2/+3, I would say, oh yeah, I'm playing like 1 or 2 copy of these. And if I'm playing a pilot deck with vigilance cards, like that's where I'd be at. But this is more situational, and I'm not sure about it yet. Next up, we've got Barrel Roll, 1-cost event in Cunning, attack of the space unit. After completing this attack, you may exhaust a space unit. I think this has a lot of potential. This is essentially just pay 1, exhaust a enemy space unit, and you get to attack. It's a tempo swing. I think that's very, very interesting sideboard tech for certain pilot decks that you're fighting, and you are also a space-based deck, to where you can play this later on, like turn 4, turn 5, and you get to get in your damage and prevent your opponent from getting in their damage. That's where I see this. A little bit interesting, definitely niche, definitely not going to be a widespread card, and may not even make the sideboard, but I think it's an option. Next up, we've got Indoctrinated Conscript, and I think this might be the last card that we're talking about today. But it's a 1 resource villainy card. You get 1/2. It's horrible. but you also get to pilot it for 1 as +1/+2. I don't really see this being used anywhere. When you talk about a lot of the pilots in specific aspects, you're going to have a lot more options, especially when you talk about command, where you have the wing. Is it winged Victor 2 or something like that? I don't remember. But the 2 pilots that are 1 cost that do way more than the Indoctrinated conscript for the average deck. I'm just not a huge fan of this one. Oh, we still have a couple more, it looks like. Jedi Light Cruiser. It's a 6 cost space unit in heroism. It's a 6/7. It's a 6 cost 6/7 heroism. It's definitely a draft card. Nothing else really. It is a capital ship, but it's in heroism, so not exactly all that relevant. It does have the Jedi tag, I guess, but yeah, not exactly all that excited for it. Oh, I take it back. We have a few more cards, actually. I thought the Indoctrinated Conscript was one of the final ones, but we actually have way more. And this one's actually really exciting. So it's a 2-cost event in aggression. You deal 3 damage to a space unit. If that unit is defeated this way, you may deal 2 damage to a base. This, I think, is one of the best sideboard cards that we've seen from the set. Let's say you're playing against those space decks where they have a bunch of, space units, and you have a guaranteed target for this for the 3 damage, and you yourself are playing a more aggressive deck. This is a way to interact with your opponent's board, but also progress your game plan. This type of effect is very, very strong in games like Magic the Gathering, where you're able to put pressure on your opponent and remove their units. This is exactly what those decks kind of want when you're playing an aggressive deck yourself. So I think it has potential. I think this is one of the better sideboard options in that specific scenario where you're aggro versus aggro, they're playing a space deck. If pilots are good, I think this has a very, very solid chance at being a good sideboard card. And that's going to wrap us up. That's going to be all the cards that we have to talk about today. There was a lot of them, and there were a good amount of cards where I'd say, yeah, you can kind of ignore them because they're draft commons and things like that. But there are a few ones that I found to be quite interesting, including a few legendaries like the Starhawk and Hondo. But let me know what your favorite cards were, and let me know what you think about the set. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure as to how many cards we have left, if there are any. But as you're seeing with a lot of these images, they are literal physical cards. So people are opening these packs, and that means that there isn't really anything left to the imagination. Like, if it gets opened, it will get posted, and we will see it in the following days. So that wraps up spoiler season. I'd love to hear your thoughts about set 4 and what your initial impressions are. Of course, if you've been playing on Carabas or any other program or any other form of Star Wars set 4, like maybe you've been playing in paper and you've been drafting it, sick. Let me know how it's been. I've been having an absolute blast. I'm going to be honest, this set, I was having fun with set 3. And maybe I've said this every set, and maybe that's just an indication of how much I've enjoying the game. But set 4 has by far been the most enjoyable set to play the cards in advance. I just think the strategies and the overall meta has just been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun to see all the aggressive decks and all the new pilots and the new mechanics and playing with all the upgrades and seeing these big space units. It's just fun. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.